Peter. And then I kept thinking, we've had lessons from First Peter for about 6 weeks. And I was thinking, well, what do I do with First Peter covering all that material? But this lesson this morning is clearly talking about suffering. Not suffering like the COVID virus, not suffering like any kind of mental illness or physical illness. It's suffering because of your faith. And I thought how strange this is in my life. When I was growing up in Winston-Salem, there were 3 main employees other than the hospitals. R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company, Haynes Corporation that had many branches, and Wachovia Bank. And young guys that graduated from school with me and going into these corporations were basically asked by some of the upper level management, and which church do you belong to? Now there were 5 big downtown churches, and the assumption was you would be joined to one of those big churches. But it was a given that you'd be a part of a church and active in a church. That's not the world today. In the fall of 1973, I spent a month in East and West Germany and Czechoslovakia. We were fascinated. This was a seminary-sponsored trip that we were exploring with other Moravians in these areas. And I was fascinated how the communist government tried to put down Christianity. In some areas, the youth in churches could do no sports, no games. They had to study the Bible. That was a requirement. Well, interesting, that didn't eliminate the church, but it made very smart young people knowing their Bible. In the now the Czech Republic, was then Czechoslovakia, we visited with a bishop in Prague, and his wife was a teacher, and her subject was history. But they said, well, you can teach, but you can't teach history. You have to teach math. And it was an hour and a half out of Prague. Another subtle way that the communist government tried to put hardship on Christians. Many Christians in that day, if they were professed Christians, could not attend university. So I saw up front some very subtle ways of persecution. I read this story this week of Benjamin Yusuf, who was born in Africa into a Muslim family. He converted to Christianity. His father disowned him, and he had nowhere to go. He was walking on foot, his only means of transportation, trying to get out of the country, was arrested, put in jail, and was persecuted horribly, beaten at night. But after each beating, he would forgive those that were beating him. One night, one of the jailers came to him in his cell and said, "What are you about? How can you forgive us? What is going on?" And Benjamin told him the story of Christ. Well, he said, "I don't understand," and left. But he came back later and said, "I want to help you escape." Benjamin got out of jail, started and made his way out of the country, out of Africa, here to the United States. He got a PhD in religious studies and then went back to Africa to plant new churches. Sometimes suffering for our gospel or suffering in the name of Jesus Christ is a choice. St. Francis and St. Clare and of Assisi, Italy, they wanted to walk in the footsteps of Christ. They wanted to experience poverty as he had. They said the essential joy in a trusting life is a testimony of how they can live in abject poverty. And it was totally against what was going on in that day with the mercantile rise of capitalism that drove people into poverty. I want to share this one story from St. Francis. St. Francis ordered the priest, Brother Leo, to write. And Leo said, look, I'm ready. Write, he said, what true joy is. A messenger arrives and said that all the masters of Paris have entered our order. Right, this isn't joy. Or that the prelates, the archbishops and bishops beyond the mountains, and as well as the King of France and the King of England have entered our Franciscan order. Right, that isn't true joy. Again, my brothers, I've gone to non-believers and converted them all to the faith. Again, that is by the grace of God. And the grace of God gave me power to perform miracles. I tell you, joy doesn't consist in these things. Then what is joy? And he told this story. I returned from Perugia, arrived here in the dead of night. It's wintertime, muddy, and so cold that icicles form on the edges of my habit and keep sticking to my leg, and blood flows from such wounds. Freezing, cold, and covered with mud, I come to the gate, and after I've knocked, a call comes from a brother inside. Who are you? Brother Francis, I answer. Go away, he says. This is not a decent hour to be wandering about. You may not come in. When I insist, he says, go away, you're simple and stupid. Don't come back to us again. There are men of us here like you. We don't need you. I stand at the door again and say, for the love of God, take me in tonight. And he replies, I will not. Go to the crozier's place and ask there. I tell you this, if I had patience and did not become upset, true joy, as well as true virtue and the salvation of my soul, would consist in these things. Francis never found joy in his accomplishments. He found joy in following Jesus in his long path. I want to end with some of the powerful words from 1 Peter. Once you were not a people, but now you're God's people. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people, in order that you may proclaim the mighty acts of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Beautiful words to describe us: a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a royal nation, God's own people.